Hello, everybody. Many of you got to this video by clicking through an article that I wrote, which suggested America feels a little bit differently about its servicemen and women than it does its veterans. So I want to use this video, one, to provide justification for my position on that statement, as well as to provide you access with a few other very rich data points that you need to know. Let me start, though, by pointing your attention back to a video that I did on a critical, dare I say, urgent and important subject. And I'll put a link to this particular area in the description of this video. But I'm going to encourage you, dare I say, urge you to go and review that video that was done about 2 months ago on the Kingdomware kill switch. It's my position that this represents a critical inflection point in 104-461, which is the Veterans First program. And if we allow this one to go unchallenged, if we allow them to win this one without opposition, dare I say, the Veterans First program may already be over, irrespective of the other tactics that I'm going to point out to you as we go through this particular video. But from a first things first perspective, right, let us agree, right, let us ratify the fact that America has always felt differently about its servicemen and women than it does about its veterans. And if you need a more standard example of that, we just need to look back in history to 1932 and the Veterans Bonus Army. And for those of you who are not familiar with this history, this represents a set of events that surrounded the actions of about 1,700 veterans, right, post-World War I, that were looking for benefits that had been promised to them by the government, but had been moved way out into the future, right? There were bonuses for their war-fighting service that was promised to them, but was only to be paid to them 27 years in the future. And of course, the Great Depression caused a sense of urgency, a sense of need. So these veterans, in a nonviolent fashion, went up to Washington to request, to utilize the political systems to request an expediting of their benefits. They did a march down Pennsylvania Avenue during this particular season, and they were attacked by the DC Police Department. So aggressively so that two of the veterans that were a part of this particular army were killed. But as is usual and customary in situations when you are dealing with a well-trained cadre of people, two of the DC police officers were also killed. Dare I say, there was no more killing between the DC police force and this particular army. Yet I digress, because the more important thing I want to point your attention to, and I'm going to put a link to this article in the description so that you can go and read it at your leisure. The president actually called on General Douglas MacArthur and General George Patton to disperse the veteran crowd. And they did so with such prejudice, as is demonstrated in this picture, that they burned down the campsite that they had developed in Anacostia Park. The point that I'm trying to make here, and this is a subtlety that is missed in this country, we have long saw the difference between our servicemen and women and our veterans as being this. Our servicemen and women go out and fight the battle and keep this country safe. Our veterans represent unfunded future liabilities that we as a country have to deal with. And if you take a really close look at the Veterans Administration systems, you take a really close look at what they are doing to erode veteran benefits in this country, you start to see a behavioral pattern that should, at a minimum, become concerning to you. So right now, I want to take you into a hearing where the new Secretary of the Veterans Administration met with both houses of Congress. They met with the Committee on Veteran Affairs from the Senate and the Committee on Veteran Affairs from the House. And they discussed the critical issues that are affecting veterans for 2019 moving forward, starting with things like the Mission Act, right? Starting with things like veteran suicide. But I'll go into that in detail as we move forward. What I want to do is point your attention to how you get access to these hearings and this information before I get started. Okay with you? All right. What you want to do, you want to go out to YouTube, and I'll put a link to this in the description of this video as well. And you want to find the House Veteran Affairs Committee. And you want to subscribe, as this little button allows, to this particular page, and click this alarm button, because what will happen as a result of your subscription and your request to be alerted, anytime there is a hearing that starts in the House, you'll receive an email alert letting you know that that hearing is there, and you can go back and revisit it at your leisure, or you can stop what you're doing and listen to the hearing at that moment, because sometimes this information is crucial, as was the case on about a month ago when they had the secretary in front of the joint Congress to answer to some of Congress's concerns about the Mission Act, veteran suicide, and what his intentions were in terms of keeping Congress informed. And a peculiar thing happened as a part of this hearing that you have to pay particular attention to. And if you're not like me, and I just happen to be a little bit of a nerd when it comes to these things, and you don't sit down and pay particular attention to what these people are saying, you miss some very important changes in the theater. And one of the big changes in the theater is a result of what not at-risk veterans like yourself and myself are unwittingly doing when we start these localized veteran-centric organizations. What you're doing, in point of fact, is actually diluting the power of our community. And you dilute it so much so that people who used to fear, I'll use that word, they used to fear us from a political perspective, now are starting to discount us. And let me give you a perfect example of what I mean here, utilizing Congress's voice. And I'll come back and explain to you what you're seeing after you have heard these particular references. Let's start with Senator Tester.
You talked about giving information to the VSOs. You talked about briefings. Are you gathering information back from them? That this just isn't an information dump on the VSOs, that you're actually listening to them and finding out what their concerns are? Because I'm telling you, it's critical. It's critical for us. It's critical for you. Did you want to answer that, Dr. Glenn?
No. And I want you to look at the anomaly here, because Senator Tester went to the staffer, right? And staffers are long-term participants in the agency. They know where the bodies lie. But watch as this newly appointed secretary, right, with less than a year of experience in the agency, jumps in and pay particular attention to what he says he has done.
I can do it. Yes, absolutely. In fact, many of the people in the audience will be with me tomorrow morning in my office discussing what was discussed here, and they will be telling me their input after.
So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here, but I'm going to tell you that a lot of VSOs have talked to me about the communication within the VA. It's not where it needs to be.
Senator, let me add one thing to that.
Okay.
You can add that pretty quickly.
I'll do it real fast. Something has happened in the makeup of our veterans population.
What had happened? What had happened?
For the first time since the fall of Saigon, half of our veterans are now under the age of 65, which means they have different cares, they have different interests. What I have done in my short time is actually open the aperture to the table.
Open the aperture to the table. Let me translate that for you. What that translates to is what he's done is he has opened the door so that he can hear the voice of some of these fringe VSO organizations and use and add their information to the body of knowledge that they are using to make a decision. That's just one example of it. Let me give you another example, and I'll give you my high-octane speculation on this one at the end.
You mentioned earlier in response to some other questions with regards to the importance of the input of VSOs and veterans in general. You responded, I think, by saying you've even expanded that audience of veterans from younger veterans and trying to get a broader representation, which I think is good. On the other hand, the leadership of the VSOs really lead by consensus within their organization and representing that broad census. So, and I too have heard from many of the VSOs that they don't feel, and particularly in the caregiver expansion, that they are or have not been involved to the degree that I believe, and I think we all believe, that they should be in terms of properly making right decisions.
Now, I think you all got that one, right? You got that one. Miss Browningly is trying to explain to this secretary, right, the faux pas that he's making by discounting, by disregarding, right, not including the foundational VSOs, right, in his decision-making process. And the reason that that is challenging for someone who's coming from the educated perspective that I'm coming from is because there are, of the population, the huge diaspora of veteran service organizations and nonprofits and the like, there's only a very small percentage of those organizations who have been authorized by Congress or recognized by Congress. Some of them authorized specifically by Congress to lobby them on issues that are of importance to you and me. So when the secretary says to Congress that he feels he's well within his rights to expand the aperture, right, what he is really saying is, I don't necessarily have to pay attention to those veteran service organizations that you all have deemed, right, to be the guide-on barriers for the community. I can listen to any which way the wind blows and come up with a solution that's going to be effective. And the problem with that, right, and again, I want to make sure, not again, let me say this because I haven't said this before. What I'm speaking to you about is not a political issue. Right? This isn't a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, right? This is a patriot issue, right? This is a nonpartisan issue where we're talking about doing the right thing by the men and women who have given the pound of flesh that they've given for this country. I'm going to give you another example before I give you my final piece of high-octane speculation in terms of where the challenge here is for the veteran community.
Mr. Secretary, let me start off by asking you a simple question, and that is the veterans organizations, to my mind, do a very good job in understanding where the veterans are at, the problems that the veterans of our country see when they interface with the VA. To my mind, what the law says is that you are to consult with the VSOs. That's what we have in law. But that does not simply mean a one-way discussion. It does not mean simply you telling them what's going on. It means you are listening to them. So let me just ask.
Okay, so let me stop Senator Sanders there by because he made an important point that is starting to become a pattern that we're seeing in this country that we need to reverse. And that is, you have language that is codified in law, that individuals who are appointed to a secretary's position or who are hired into a GS position feel that it's within their rights to ignore. That's why we have the outcome that we're experiencing from that Court of Federal Claims decision on the J&A, even in light of the fact that the judge saw undeniably that the actions that the agency was participating in was in violation of the Veterans First regulation law. It was also in violation of the Fair Competition Act. That judge saw it within his discretion not to intervene. And the reason that he chose to use as his justification for not intervening actually caused him to be in violation of his code of ethics as a judge. Now, this is where I need to have a conversation with those of you who are part of a veteran service organization, or those of you who are interested in becoming a part of a veteran service organization. It is incumbent upon us to consolidate and condense our strength so that we can speak truth to this kind of power when there is a violation. And we have a violation of this greatest magnitude that's going on right now, because those veterans that are locked out of that Med-Surg prime vendor contract are going from not at risk to being at risk. Because the manufacturers who yesterday used to give them access to products and services are closing off those spigots because they don't need them anymore. And the non-veteran organizations who have been given the authority under this J&A, they are running roughshod because they're trying to create a position between themselves and the manufacturer so that in a future competition for that same contract, they can deliver an urgent and compelling economic justification for not utilizing veterans and disabled veterans moving forward. And when I talk to our veteran service organization leaders about an immediate intervention, it frustrates me to hear them say to me that there's nothing that we can do when there is a clear path forward. So I'm concerned, and I have to admit this openly here, about whether or not our veteran service organizations are operating out of ignorance or taking no action because of that ignorance, or something more nefarious has happened. Because you're talking about a $4 to $5 billion requirement here that somehow has been shifted out of the Veterans Administration into the hands of the private sector. So inherently governmental functions have been thrown over the fence into the private sector, and that toss has thrown those requirements over the heads of the veteran community that by law were supposed to receive those benefits. Now, I'm not the sharpest pencil in the shed, but I got to tell you, if it smells like a duck, it quacks like a duck, doggone it, you better get me some duck sauce, because I love duck. And in this particular instance, as it relates to not just the Med-Surg prime vendor issue, but as it relates to issues that are more close to home for you and I, issues like the Mission Act and the attempt or not attempt to privatize the VA need to be taken a close look at. Why don't we take a close look at that, right? Why don't we take a close look at what the true outcome, what the true potential trajectory of this Mission Act is? Because as I read the act, when you're dealing with an obligation that has been moved from a mandatory spend in the appropriation and budget process to a discretionary spend in the appropriation and budget process. And that's what has happened to the Mission Act, and the community care dollars are all discretionary spend. If there is no increase in the cap, therefore the VA has no ability to increase the discretionary dollars that they will use for community care. They're going to have to they're going to have to make up those costs another way. And you know what normally happens? Benefits sucker. Hospitals close down. Services are outsourced at large to the private sector. Is that a possibility here? I don't know, but I'm going to tell you, it looks like it's pointing in that direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me get unanimous consent to place into the record a recent article that appeared in ProPublica and Political Fact.
Without objection.
Thank you. And it talks about the fact that several private companies have been paid nearly $2 billion for overhead, including profit, to provide health care to veterans, and that's about 24% of the company's total program expenses. So we have enormous administrative costs in private care for veterans at a time when I hope we could agree that the function of the VA is to provide the highest quality care to all veterans in a cost-effective way. And Mr. Chairman, my ongoing concern, and this article kind of demonstrates that, is that we are in the process of dismembering the VA, taking resources away from the VA, putting it into the private sector, and the results will be that many of our veterans will not get the quality care that they deserve.
Now, listen, I don't want to be a fear mongerer here, right? I'm just dealing with the facts, right? I'm dealing with the facts that say that if they have created a law that allows veterans to have the discretion to make choices in terms of whether or not they're going to use the poorest veteran healthcare system or whether or not they are going to use the private care system, a lot of veterans, especially if you're living in an area where your veteran hospital isn't one of the stars of the system, are going to opt to go and utilize the private system. And if you've got this behemoth that's just sucking money but not providing any services, and you don't have the ability to increase the discretionary spending to keep both afloat, well, what's going to happen? One's going to sink and the other one is going to rise to the top like cream. And folks, let me give you a little bit of an insight here, right? Because in my last video, I promised that I would come back and provide you with the top 10 issues that we have to be concerned about, many of which I outlined in that article. But what you may not be aware of is the fact that I went through an experiment recently. I went through an experiment of eating my own dog food, so to speak. I know I come out and I rail against what the acquisition people have been doing to the veteran-owned small businesses, but I hadn't taken time to take a good look at our veteran healthcare system. So I did that because I'm a card-carrying disabled veteran, service-connected disabled veteran, as a matter of fact. And I was in a position where I needed a knee replacement surgery. Although I have my own high-quality private insurance through TRICARE, I elected to utilize the VA systems in my community for my surgery. And some people asked me if I really wanted to do that. You really want to risk yourself to the VA system? But after doing an exhaustive investigation, I found that the VA hospital in my community was a star and had a connected relationship with the teaching hospital SUNY at Stony Bridge, SUNY, the State University of New York at Stony Bridge. So a lot of the top surgeons that have been doing my kind of surgery were going to be performing my surgery. So I said, I'm going to go ahead and give this thing a shot. So on December 13th, which is just about 6 weeks ago, I actually went into the Veterans Hospital and had my knee replacement surgery done. Now, what it took for me to get there was more than 18 months worth of evaluation, which allowed me to look at every aspect of their system, whether it was the phlebotomists and testing and the ultrasound people and the urologists. I mean, they cleared every possible system that I had to make sure that I was ready for this surgery. And I got to tell you, absent this institutional issue, which I'll talk to you about in more detail in another video, I had a quality of care at that veteran hospital that was consistent or better than the care that I had received at civilian hospitals historically. Actually, the care was better than I had received back in 1983, which is when they did the first operation on my knee at a military hospital in Fort Knox, Kentucky. What I'm suggesting to you folks is that our veteran healthcare system and its state is good. It just needs an investment and attention in order to handle the demand for the population that we have created, especially as a result of this new set of conflicts. So any idea, any assertion that we are going to just take these dollars en masse and throw them out into the private system and expect them to give our veterans the same level of care that they get from the Veterans Administration is, in my opinion, illogical. In my opinion, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, sure, there's some institutional memory issues at the VA that need to be cleaned up. One of them, a critical one, is the idea that the veteran hospitals are just one step above indigent care, meaning the veterans are just one step above those community hospitals, those community-based organizations that provide healthcare to those people who can't afford it. And yes, that culture, that attitude does exist within the VA. And those of you who work for the VA, I'm sorry, if the shoe fits, you got to wear it. All right? Because the way I saw some of the other veterans treated, just as a normal function of the way these organizations operate. As a matter of fact, as I was treated in the normal function of the way things operated at that veteran hospital, I mean, I felt as if I was a burden to the employee who was supposed to be doing the job for me, whether it was me asking for information about some extracurricular event or just needing some additional medication or wanting to move from room to room. My point, very simply, is that we've got some institutional memory areas that we need to clear up within our veteran hospitals. But from a broader perspective, those institutions provide a quality service. They provide a quality of care that is worth defending, it's worth protecting. So I'm going to stand on the record here, and I'm going to say in no uncertain terms that we need to ask our Congress to take a closer look at the implementation effort that they're doing under this Mission Act. And before you go forward with driving additional billions of dollars out into the public sector, you give our VA hospitals a chance. And none of that matters. None of that makes a difference if the power of our veteran vote continues to be diluted by these veteran service organizations that develop on the fringe and are somehow trotted out as if they are the bellwether. Perfect case in point, and this is a guy that I know personally. I like him as an individual, but he is an example of the problem in my particular opinion. And his name is Scott Dennison. Many of you know him as the leader of the Veteran Business Coalition. And you will see that organization, when there's a business-related issue on the Hill, you'll see Scott trotted up to give testimony alongside the American Legion and some of our other stellar veteran organizations. The problem or challenge there is that Scott doesn't represent a constituency that's large enough to move the needle. And when we need to influence one of our political leaders in a direction, left, right, or indifferent, if they see us as a herd of cats with no direction and no real leadership, then they don't have to listen to us, as our current Veterans Secretary is suggesting that he doesn't. Right? I can listen to any of these veteran organizations because, you know, something has changed and they're younger veterans. I agree with that point. But to you, the not at risk veteran, I'm going to tell you in no uncertain terms that we have to not be a part of our own problem. Therefore, I'm going to encourage you, dare I say, urge you to drop your affiliation with your localized veteran organization and become a member of one of our national bellwethers. If it's not the American Legion, if it's not the Veterans of Foreign Wars, it's got to be one of the VSOs that is authorized by Congress to lobby it on our behalf. Because if you don't do that, you diminish our ability to speak truth to power when someone in the House introduces a bill to require disabled veterans to certify themselves for participation in federal contracting. Now, the problem with that, if you all aren't following that particular challenge, is that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, when they passed Public Law 108-1850, recognized that requiring veterans, disabled veterans specifically, who are card carrying, right, who have DD-214s to validate their status as a disabled veteran, requiring them to certify themselves for government contracting just adds another layer of cost, which is another barrier to entry for them in business. And therefore, they said, allow the disabled veteran to self-certify. Now, I'm a reasonable person. I'm willing to play with the art of the deal. So my position as it relates to this whole government-wide certification, this government-wide verification issue for veterans, my position is very simple. Bring the bill to the table and let's sit down and negotiate it. And if we get something, as we did in the Veterans Administration for verification, then we will accept a government-wide verification. As an example, in the Veterans Administration, when we took on the extra cost and burden of verification, we got first priority in contracting with the VA under Public Law 109-461. And I would submit, and I would argue, that if we are going to accept government-wide verification where no verification exists now, we should get something in return for that concession, for that consideration. Now, I'm not expecting something as robust as Vets First government-wide, although I'll take it if you'll give it to me. What I do think is reasonable to ask is that we maybe make a concession for our brothers and sisters who are not covered by a procurement program. So to be specific, under the federal government procurement programs, there's a goal out there for veteran contracting, but there's no procurement program to back it. Veterans don't have sole source contracting. Veterans don't have business development. Veterans don't have many of the benefits and advantages that the disabled veteran community enjoys as it relates to contracting. So my position would be, okay, great. Let's combine the percentage of goaling for veterans and disabled veterans for this government-wide verification. Let's prioritize it as we did in VA, service disabled veterans first, and then veterans second. Let's give that veteran contracting program real sole source contracting capability, not this convoluted crap that they have right now, which says you got to be the only service disabled veteran in the world able to do it in order for a contracting officer to do a sole source contract. what I mean by that is give us the sole source capability that you give to the small and disadvantaged businesses under the 8A program, and we will accept your government-wide verification. But this idea that is being promoted, that government-wide verification is a good thing for the disabled veteran business community, I want to disabuse you of that idea, and I stand ready to sit down and have a conversation, discussion, or debate with any individual who can bring a reasonable argument to the table that says incurring an additional burden, an additional barrier to entry for veterans makes sense without giving them something that's going to be of value for that additional burden. Yet I digress, because I wanted to keep this particular presentation focused on the hearing that we had with the new Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. And folks, I want you to go through this particular hearing when you have time with a fine-tooth comb, because I walked away from this hearing extremely concerned about whether or not some of the reports that I'm hearing in the broader media about what the intention is of this group with the Veterans Administration, whether or not it's true. And I got to admit that, you know, when I'm seeing some of the responses that we're getting from this particular secretary and his team, I'm concerned. I mean, I'm concerned when they talk about the biggest blight on the government, which is the rate of suicide among veterans, is an issue that this group has not even developed a matrix to measure. So if you ask them, you know, how you doing, they'll say fine. And if you ask them to explain how do they know that they're doing fine, they can't go back and say, well, these were the goals, these were the parameters that we set in place, and we are exceeding expectation here. We are not meeting expectation there. They don't even have those matrices in place. Their organization is so disjointed that the dollars that were allocated to educate veterans about the suicide prevention programs that are available to them weren't even consumed during 2018. They promised to use more of them in 2019. We got a complex problem on our hands here, folks. But you, the not at-risk veteran like myself, it is incumbent upon us to take up the responsibility for our fellow fraternity members that are at risk and that are being impacted by a system that's pushing them closer and closer and closer to the tipping point. And we do not want our fraternity members, we do not want our brothers and sisters in arms to move over that tipping point, because the potential outcome is catastrophic. It's dangerous, and nobody wants to say it. Back in, I think it was 1999, somewhere around there, 99, 2000, somewhere in that area, the Department of Homeland Security came out with its list of terrorist threats to the United States government, and they put returning veterans in the top 10 of domestic threats for terrorism in this country. You know why they did that? They did that because of the training that we received while in service in the United States government. They did that because if you look back at the history of the domestic terrorists that have impacted this country, all of them were trained military members. Now, I'm not here to scare anybody. I'm here to create a call to action so that we can all cooperate and just get along. But it's not going to occur unless you and I make a demand. Power does not succeed without a demand. As you can see with our current infighting between our administration and Congress, between our current commander-in-chief and Congress. And again, this is not a partisan issue that I'm sharing with you. This is a patriotic issue I'm bringing your attention to. We do not want him and her, who has already given their pound of flesh and borne the weight of the battle, to be further injured on this soil, here in these United States, because of a few opportunists, because of a few ignorant, because of a few apathetic individuals that take them for granted. So I'm going to close this little tete-a-tete out by asking you again, go back and review this hearing. Join a sanctioned veteran service organization like the American Legion, right? Become an active member, because as we approach the 2020 election, it is going to be absolutely critical that you allow your voice to be heard as they prepare to go to the ballot box. Because at the end of the day, we still represent the largest single voting bloc in North America. And therefore, we want that voting bloc to usher in policies and procedures that increase the level of security as opposed to decreasing the level of protection and security here in these United States of America. This is Walter Cotton. That's all I have for this installment. Until next time, I'm going to say, I'm out.